It started on my very first day of high school, when everything still smelled like fresh paint and false hopes. I was nervous, quiet, just another face in a sea of teenagers trying to find where they fit. My clothes didn't match. My backpack had a broken strap, and I stood alone at the edge of the courtyard, watching the groups form like puzzle pieces I didn't belong to. That's when I met her, the principal, Mrs. Ellsworth. She had a sharp voice and sharper eyes, the kind that didn't miss anything except apparently compassion. She scanned the new students, then stopped at me. She walked over with that stiff walk of authority, looked me up and down, and with a half smile that wasn't kind, said loud enough for a few students nearby to hear, "Looks like we've got ourselves another drifter." The kids laughed. I didn't even know what she meant, but I knew it wasn't good. That was the moment she gave me my nickname. I wasn't Daniel anymore. I was the Drifter, a label that clung to me harder than any grade or report card ever would. And from that moment on, she never once looked at me like someone with potential, only like a mistake waiting to happen. What she didn't know was that I was already used to being underestimated. What she didn't know was that I had already learned to turn pain into fuel. And one day I'd make sure she remembered that name. Not because I failed, but because I turned it into something none of them saw coming. The nickname Drifter followed me like a shadow down every hallway, whispered just low enough to sting, but loud enough that I'd never forget it. At first, I tried to ignore it. I kept my head down, did my homework, sat in the back of every classroom. But the thing about being labeled early is that people stop seeing what you do. They only look for reasons to confirm what they already believe. So when my grades started to slip in the middle of freshman year, nobody asked why. Nobody wondered if something was going on at home or if I was struggling to keep up. They just nodded, as if it proved something they already knew. Especially, her Mrs. Ellsworth didn't need evidence to pass judgment. She had a way of talking that felt like being handed a sentence instead of advice. I remember one day after a math quiz I had failed miserably, I was called to her office. The walls were lined with awards and photos of her shaking hands with governors, smiling with straight-A students who went on to Ivy League colleges. Her desk was perfectly clean, except for one thing, my file. It was open in front of her like a case already closed. She didn't even ask me to sit. She just looked up from the folder, took off her glasses, and said, "You're wasting your time here. And worse, you're wasting ours." I stood frozen, not knowing what to say. "Some kids just don't have what it takes," she continued. "And that's not an insult, it's reality. We all have our place in the world. Yours might not be in school." I left her office with a tight chest and a burning throat. Not because I believed her, but because a part of me wanted to scream that she didn't know anything about me. That my mom worked 2 jobs and couldn't help with homework. That I sometimes skipped breakfast to save lunch money. That I wasn't lazy. I was tired. But you don't explain those things to someone like her. She didn't care. She had already filed me away under lost cause. And once the principal brands you, teachers start treating you differently too. Assignments came back with more red than black ink. Nobody stayed after class to ask if I understood. The counselor never called me in. I became invisible in every way except when I failed. And even then, it was like they were waiting for it. I started skipping school more often because what was the point? They didn't expect anything from me, so I stopped expecting anything from them. But what they didn't realize was that underneath that disinterest, a different kind of fire was forming. Not the kind that burns quickly, but the slow, stubborn kind that builds over time. I wasn't angry yet, but I was collecting. Every word, every look, every moment of dismissal. I was storing it all somewhere deep. I didn't have the power to fight back yet, but I had already made the decision. If I couldn't matter here, I'd make them remember me later. Not as a dropout, not as the drifter, but as the one who made it without them, and I would do it so loud they'd have no choice but to listen. By the time sophomore year rolled around, I was already carrying the weight of a reputation I hadn't chosen. The grades kept slipping. Not because I didn't care, but because school had become a battlefield where I didn't have the right armor. Every test felt like another swing from a system built to bruise kids like me and reward the ones who fit neatly into its expectations. I was barely holding it together, and all it took was one more blow to knock me completely off balance. That blow came in the form of a letter sent home. It wasn't the first warning, but it was the first that carried the weight of consequence. I was failing 3 classes, and now the school wanted a parent meeting. I didn't want to give it to my mom. She was already stretched thin, 2 cleaning jobs during the week, 1 on weekends, and still somehow found time to pack my lunch and remind me to wear clean socks. But I handed it to her anyway, silently, watching her face fold with concern as she read it. She didn't say much, just nodded and told me she'd take the afternoon off work. My stepdad didn't say anything at all. He just muttered something about me ruining everything and left the room. The day of the meeting, I sat outside the principal's office while my parents went in. I wasn't allowed to be in the room for the first half, something about privacy and letting the school speak freely. I stared at the floor tiles, counting the cracks, trying to guess what they were saying. I imagined it, my test scores on the desk, comments from teachers, cold statistics being read like an obituary, for a future not yet lived. But nothing could have prepared me for what I saw when the door finally opened. My mom walked out first. She didn't look angry. She didn't even look sad. She looked small, as if something inside her had folded. Her shoulders were hunched in a way I'd never seen before, like she was trying to hide from the world. My stepdad followed, face like stone, eyes avoiding mine completely. And then came Mrs. Ellsworth, right behind them, not even pretending, to hide the smug satisfaction on her face. She clapped her hands together and said loudly, "Well, hopefully this will be a wake-up call for all of you." I didn't know what she had said in that room, but I could feel it in the silence that followed. At home that night, my mom sat at the table in her work uniform, hands clasped together like she was praying, even though she wasn't. She finally said, "They said you're not trying, that you act like you don't want to be there, that you don't care." I tried to tell her that wasn't true, that I did care, that I just didn't know how to keep up anymore. But the words got tangled in my throat, and all that came out was silence, and she just nodded like she'd expected it. That night I sat in bed and stared at the ceiling, burning with shame. Not because I was failing, but because I had let her, the same woman who once taught me how to spell my name, walk out of that building feeling like I had made her a failure too. That was the worst part. Not the grades, not the reputation, but the look in her eyes, like she was beginning to believe them too. That's when something shifted. I stopped thinking about revenge or justice or even proving people wrong. I started thinking about her, about how I could take all the things that made me feel small and worthless and somehow turn them into something that would make her proud to sit in any room, especially the one where they once made her feel ashamed. I didn't know how yet. I didn't know when. But I made myself a quiet promise that night, in the dark, staring at a cracked ceiling I'd seen 1,000 times before. One day, I would make them invite me back. Not as a warning, not as a cautionary tale, but as the guest of honor. And this time, I wouldn't be the one standing outside the door. It was the end of that same semester. The air in the school hallways was heavy with the usual end-of-term mix, relief for some, dread for others. I was in the second group. Most students ripped open their report cards with excitement, hoping for praise or privileges at home. I opened mine with the quiet, sinking certainty of someone bracing for another blow. I had seen enough red marks by then to know what to expect. But this time, something was different. Tucked inside the folded paper wasn't just the printed grade sheet. It was a handwritten note clipped to the corner with a paperclip that had been carefully bent into the shape of a star. Like someone thought they were being kind, but the words cut deeper than any grade ever could. It wasn't long, just 2 sentences, written in tight, slanted handwriting I recognized immediately. Some students were never meant for academic paths. Find a job that suits your temperament. Something with your hands, maybe. No name, no signature, but I didn't need one. I'd seen that handwriting too many times on late slips and detention forms. It was Mrs. Ellsworth, and I don't know if she meant it to be cruel. Maybe in her mind, that was advice. Maybe she thought she was helping me set realistic expectations. But to a 15-year-old kid who had just watched his mother cry at a school meeting and hadn't felt proud of anything in months, it felt like a verdict. I stared at the note for a long time. The hallway was empty by then. Most kids had gone home or to the front lawn to celebrate their final grades. I stayed in the shadow of the lockers, holding that piece of paper like it was alive, like it was breathing something poisonous into my chest. I remember feeling a strange calm, the kind that doesn't come from peace, but from exhaustion. The kind that settles in when hope has left the room and something colder replaces it. I didn't show the note to my mom. I couldn't. She was already carrying too much, and I couldn't add my shame to her burden. Instead, I folded it twice and tucked it into the back pocket of my backpack, where it stayed for years. I didn't tape it to my wall or burn it dramatically. I didn't use it as fuel, at least not at first. I just carried it with me, like a scar in my pocket, like something I wasn't ready to let go of, but couldn't look at too often either. Over time, though, that note started to change meaning. It wasn't overnight, but every time I felt like quitting, I'd reach into that pocket, not even on purpose, and my fingers would brush against it, and I'd remember her words. Some students were never meant for academic paths, and I'd whisper back in my mind, maybe not, but I was meant for something. It became a quiet mantra. I stopped trying to prove her wrong with test scores. I stopped begging the school to see me. Instead, I started trying to see myself. I began noticing things that made me feel alive, solving problems, building things, fixing broken electronics I found in dumpsters. I spent nights on forums, teaching myself how to code simple tools. I started selling secondhand phone repairs out of my garage. I saved everything. Every cent. I wasn't aiming for a diploma anymore. I was building something she could never grade. A foundation not made of GPA or permission slips, but of fire, and brick, and resilience. And through it all, that note stayed. With me. Not as a curse, but as a reminder. That someone once told me I was unfit to dream. And that someday, I'd read it again. Not with bitterness, but with a smile. In a room full of people who had no idea what it had cost me to stand there. There's something strange about the way a moment can burn itself into your memory so deeply that no matter how many years pass, you can still feel the air, still smell the dust in the hallway, still hear the exact words as if they're being whispered again. That day wasn't just another failure in a long list. It was the day I finally stopped hoping the system would save me. And it all started with a rumor. It wasn't even my fight. A few students got into an argument in the cafeteria. Someone threw food, someone else threw a chair, and within minutes it turned into one of those chaotic scenes that schools like to pretend only happen in other districts. I wasn't even sitting at the same table. But when the dust settled, when the staff rushed in and tried to pin the blame on someone, my name came up. Not because anyone saw me do anything, but because when you're the drifter, trouble is your shadow, even when you're standing in the light. They didn't ask for witnesses. They didn't check the cameras. They just called me to the office. Again. And when I walked in, Mrs. Ellsworth was already waiting. She didn't ask for my side. She didn't ask for anything. She just handed me a slip of paper and said, 3-day suspension. Maybe that'll teach you not to stir the pot. I opened my mouth to protest, and before I could finish the sentence, she laughed. Not the kind of laugh that's awkward or uncertain. Not a chuckle. A full, sharp laugh. Like what I'd said was ridiculous. You really think I haven't seen this act before? She asked, tilting her head. Boys like you always find trouble and always play the victim when it shows up. That was the first time I felt something break. Not in the room, but inside me. Not the fragile kind of breaking that comes with tears or fear. It was quieter than that. Colder. A thread snapping. A wall hardening. I remember looking at her in that moment and realizing she didn't see me as a student. She saw me as a problem to be managed. A statistic. A nuisance. And maybe, in her eyes, suspending me wasn't about discipline. It was about reinforcing the story she had already written. I walked out of the office with the slip in my hand and 1,000 thoughts running through my head, none of them loud. I didn't go home. I walked for hours instead, circling the neighborhood, sitting on broken swings in the park, staring at empty basketball courts. I couldn't go home and face my mom with another failure. I couldn't explain a punishment. I didn't earn. So I sat in silence and tried to figure out what to do next. Not just for the suspension, for my life. It was in that silence that something began to form. An idea. A promise. That if the school was going to keep handing me punishments I didn't deserve, then I was going to start building something no one could take from me. That night, I opened the old laptop I'd found in a dumpster months before and began repairing it with parts I'd salvaged. It took me 2 days to make it run. But once it did, I stayed up until dawn learning how to build websites. I didn't know why yet. I just knew I needed a world outside of theirs. By the time my suspension was over, I hadn't done any homework, but I'd made my first dollar selling a refurbished phone, and it felt more real than anything I'd ever learned in that building. When I came back, Mrs. Ellsworth barely looked at me, just nodded and said, "Try not to make another scene." But I wasn't there for her anymore. I was there for the exit, the slow, steady path out. And one day I'd come back, Not through that office, but through the front entrance to a room filled with students and applause. And when I did, I'd remember that laugh. Not as the sound of defeat, but as the last time I let her define who I was. There's a kind of silence that doesn't feel empty. It feels like the calm before something begins. I remember sitting in my room after that suspension, the walls still covered in peeling paint, the fan spinning with a faint rattle above my bed. I was staring at the cracked ceiling again, the same one I used to look at as a kid while pretending I was somewhere else, somewhere better. But that night wasn't about escape. That night, something inside me shifted in a way I couldn't undo. I stopped waiting for the world to understand me. I stopped waiting for apologies or fairness, or for someone to give me a chance. And in that stillness, I made myself a promise. I didn't say it out loud. There was no dramatic music, no lightning bolt of inspiration. It was quiet, and that made it more real. I looked at the note she had written, the one that told me I belonged to the world of lost causes, and I folded it neatly, tucked it into the small metal box where I kept things I couldn't explain to anyone. And I whispered inside my head, "One day, you're going to clap for me. Not because you want to, but because the entire room will be clapping and you'll have no choice." That thought, that sentence, stayed with me like a string tied around my soul. I didn't suddenly become perfect. My grades didn't soar. I didn't wake up a genius. But everything I did from that point on had a pulse running through it, a reason. Even when I failed, it felt like a step. Even when I stumbled, I understood that I was moving forward, not circling the same dead end like before. The pain still came, but now it had a rival, purpose. I started fixing more things: phones, game consoles, old speakers from neighbors who couldn't afford to replace them. I'd come home with dirt under my fingernails and a few dollars in my pocket, and though my stepdad still scoffed and said it wasn't real work, my mom started smiling a little more. She didn't understand the coding or the repairs or the forums I was glued to late at night, but she brought me snacks while I worked and told me to rest my eyes. That was her way of saying she believed in me, even when she didn't know what. I was building. I stayed invisible in school. That was fine. I wanted it that way. Let them think I had disappeared. Let them believe I'd given up. Because while they were looking the other way, I was laying bricks for a foundation they couldn't see. I built websites for local businesses for $50 each. I started fixing laptops for students who needed them fast. I watched online courses nobody assigned, read books no teacher recommended. Every time I saw Mrs. Ellsworth in the hallway, her eyes passed over me like I was glass. But in my mind, I was already standing on that stage, already hearing the applause, already seeing her face the moment she realized who I had become. I began journaling every night, not about what happened, but about what would happen. I wrote about the business I'd start, the product I'd launch, the speech I'd give when I came back as a guest. I didn't know how or when, but I was building a life she couldn't grade, a future she couldn't control, a version of myself that no nickname could reduce. And with every late night, every dollar earned, every obstacle I pushed through without anyone noticing, the vision grew sharper. I wasn't trying to punish her anymore. I wasn't obsessed with revenge. I just wanted the truth to outgrow the lie. I wanted to become so loud in the world that her silence wouldn't matter. I wanted her to sit in the audience one day, surrounded by students who admired me, teachers who praised me, and applause that echoed longer than any suspension ever did. And when that day came, I wouldn't point at her. I wouldn't name her. I'd simply smile and begin the speech I had written in the dark, because I didn't need her to say she was wrong. I just needed her to know it. After high school, I didn't walk across a stage. There was no cap, no gown, no proud moment frozen in time by a camera. I left quietly, almost like I'd never been there. Just a final attendance sheet with my name on it. One last indifferent glance from Mrs. Ellsworth, and a silence so complete it could have convinced anyone I had vanished for good. And in a way I did. Not out of shame, not out of defeat, but because sometimes the only way to grow is to disappear, so no one can see you breaking through the ground. While the others packed their bags for college dorms and posed in group photos wearing university hoodies, I moved into the back room of a friend's garage. It was cold in the winter and suffocating in the summer, but it had one thing I never had before: space that was mine. A place where I didn't have to apologize for being behind. A place where failure didn't feel like a performance in front of people rooting against me. That room became my laboratory, my classroom, my headquarters. I had no degree, no diploma, But I had something more dangerous: obsession. Not with revenge, but with creation. I woke up every day with a hunger that couldn't be quieted by fear. I taught myself code until my eyes stung. I learned about UX design, digital marketing, dropshipping, affiliate models, payment gateways. I didn't even know half those words when I started. But I didn't stop to ask permission. I just studied them like they were keys to a kingdom no one wanted me to enter. By 19, I had built my first profitable app. Nothing fancy, just a scheduling tool for freelancers like me who had to juggle too much on their own. I sold it for a small profit and rolled everything I made into my next project, a digital storefront system for small business owners, especially immigrant families who didn't speak fluent English and were being overcharged by bloated platforms. I built it with clean interfaces, simple icons, voice assistants. I sat in barbershops and bakeries helping them set it up, explaining everything with the same clarity I wish someone had given me back in school. And slowly, word spread, not through headlines or viral posts, but through whispers. Families that trusted no one started calling me by name. They didn't care I hadn't gone to college. They cared that I showed up, that I listened, that I delivered something real. At 21, I registered my company. At 22, I hired my first employee, someone who, like me, had been written off by the same system. We worked out of that same garage with old desks and thrift store chairs. But to me, it was a cathedral, a place where belief was built, brick by digital brick. And through all those years, I never once went back to the school. I didn't need to. I hadn't built this for them. But the dream stayed in my back pocket, folded like that note I still kept. One day I would return, not to demand recognition, not to prove anything to Mrs. Ellsworth, but to look into the faces of the students sitting where I once sat and tell them, they don't get to decide how far you go. The beauty of disappearing is that no one sees you coming. While they were measuring my worth in test scores and tardies, I was quietly building a machine strong enough to change lives. And the irony? The very hands they said were only good for simple jobs had learned to build tools that even their most decorated students couldn't understand. So I stayed gone, building, quietly, until one day the email came, from a name I recognized, the school, inviting me to speak at an alumni event, to share your journey. No apologies, no mention of the past, just a polite request, as if I were one of them. I stared at that email for a long time, and then I smiled. The seeds planted in silence were finally growing into thunder. The email sat unread for 2 full days. Not because I didn't see it, but because I didn't know how to feel about it. The subject line was simple: Alumni Spotlight. Invitation to speak? Sent from the school's official address, signed not by Mrs. Ellsworth, but by the new vice principal. Someone I had never met. Someone who had no idea of what those hallways had once meant to me, or what I had buried there just to keep breathing. The message was polite. Too polite. We would be honored to have you share your inspiring journey with our current students during this year's Alumni Week. We've been following your company's success and believe your story would offer tremendous value. Tremendous value. I closed the email and leaned back in my chair. My office was quiet, sun pouring in through tall windows that looked nothing, like the school's fluorescent-lit corridors. I had built this space myself, chose every inch of it. It was the opposite of what I had known. Clean, calm, mine. But now, the shadows of that old building were creeping through a single screen, a digital doorway to a place I had sworn I'd never need again. I could have ignored it. I could have deleted it, replied with a polite no, or just ghosted the message entirely. But instead, I left it there. Let it haunt me. Because some ghosts don't rattle chains. They just wait patiently for acknowledgement. That night, I pulled out the old metal box. I hadn't opened it in years. Inside were scraps of the kid I used to be, doodles on detention slips, faded notes from the few friends I had back then, and, still folded with the same perfect creases, the letter Mrs. Ellsworth had once tucked inside my report card. I unfolded it slowly, read the words again. Some students were never meant for academic paths. It no longer stung like it once had. It felt distant now, like a prophecy spoken over someone else's life, but it still pulsed with memory. I ran my fingers across the ink, then placed the paper back in the box, carefully. I didn't need to prove her wrong anymore. That part of the story had already written itself. But maybe, just maybe, this was a chance to reclaim the space. Not for me. For the ones still sitting in those chairs, wondering if their silence meant they were invisible, wondering if their struggle meant they had no future. So I clicked reply. I kept it short. Thank you for the invitation. I would be honored to speak. And when I hit send, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel angry. I felt something quieter, something like resolution, a full circle drawing itself closed. In the weeks that followed, I didn't tell anyone, not my staff, not my family. I prepared the speech in private, not a pitch, not a bragging session, just the truth, the story as it happened, the moments that shaped me, the failures, the humiliations, the things they didn't put on the walls or in the yearbooks. I wrote it for the version of me who once sat outside the principal's office, too ashamed to go home. And then the day arrived. Walking through the front doors of that school again felt like stepping into a dream where everything is familiar, but slightly off. The walls were the same dull beige, the trophy case had a few new plaques, and the front desk secretary smiled at me without a hint of recognition. Of course she didn't know who I was. The school had forgotten me long before I ever left it. But when I stepped into the auditorium and saw the rows of students settling into their seats, whispering, scrolling, laughing quietly, I saw myself in every third row, in the kids who didn't bother looking up, in the ones who sat alone, in the ones who slouched low to make themselves smaller. I saw him again, the boy they once called a waste of potential. And in that moment, I didn't need revenge. I didn't even care if Mrs. Ellsworth was in the crowd. This wasn't about her anymore. This was about them. I stepped up to the podium, adjusted the mic, and began. When I was your age, I was told I'd never make it out of this building. Not because I wasn't smart, not because I didn't try, but because someone decided my story before I ever had the chance to write it myself. And for the first time in that school, the room listened. I don't remember planning to say the things I said. I had notes in my pocket, pages of carefully written sentences, but once I looked into that room, into the faces of students leaning on their fists, slouched in their chairs, waiting for another adult to speak at them instead of to them, I knew the paper in my pocket was useless, because what they needed wasn't a presentation. It was a confession, a mirror, a reminder that they weren't alone in their silence, and that failure didn't mean finality. So I let the paper stay where it was and spoke from somewhere deeper than memory. I told them how I once sat in those same rows pretending not to care. How every insult, every suspension, every skipped grade didn't harden me, it hollowed me. How I spent more time surviving than learning. How no one ever pulled me aside to ask why I was slipping, just that I was. And how, in the middle of all that, someone looked me in the eye and said I would never become anything, that my path ended here. I could see it then, the way the room shifted. A few heads lifted, phones slipped into pockets, not because I was yelling or putting on a show, but because they had heard those words too. Maybe not from a teacher, maybe from a parent, a coach, a sibling, or maybe just from that voice inside that grows louder when no one else speaks up. I told them about the night I promised myself someone would clap for me one day, about building a company from a garage with secondhand tools and no roadmap, about learning to see silence not as proof of failure, but as space where growth hides. I told them that every moment someone dismissed me became fuel. Not for anger, but for direction. That I didn't succeed in spite of being underestimated, but because of it. And then I paused. I looked around the auditorium and found the ones who hadn't moved since I began. The quiet ones, the ones with eyes that didn't blink. I told them, they will try to define you by your worst days, because that's easier than understanding your story. But you are not your lowest point. You are every hour you kept going after it. It was quiet when I stopped speaking. Not uncomfortable silence, something else, like the air itself was holding its breath. Then someone clapped. One student, then another, then a wave. Not thunderous, not explosive, but real, earned. And somewhere in that sound, I felt something click into place, something I didn't know had been waiting all this time. The applause wasn't for success, it was for recognition. Theirs, not mine. They weren't clapping, because I made it. They were clapping because I had spoken a truth they recognized in themselves. When I stepped off the stage, I was surrounded almost immediately, not by teachers, not by administration, but by students, dozens of them, asking questions, not about money or apps or business, but about how to keep going when no one believes in you, how to stay focused when everything around you tries to pull you under. How to trust that your path matters even when it's invisible. I stayed for hours, longer than planned. I spoke to them until the auditorium was almost empty. One boy, maybe 16, stayed behind after everyone else. He didn't speak at first, just stood beside me, holding his backpack like a shield. Then, in a low voice, he asked, "Do you really think someone like me could do what you did?" I looked him in the eye and said, "You're already doing it. Just by staying here, just by asking." He nodded. Didn't smile, just nodded, and that was enough. Later, as I was leaving the building, I passed the main office. The door was open. Inside, sitting behind the same desk that once judged me, was Mrs. Ellsworth, older, thinner, hair streaked with gray. She looked up. For a moment, she didn't recognize me. Then something changed in her face, just slightly. I nodded. She didn't smile, didn't say a word, but her eyes lingered as I walked past, and that was all I needed. I didn't need her praise. I didn't want her apology. She had heard the applause. The days after the speech felt strange, as if I had left part of myself in that auditorium and walked away slightly lighter. I returned to my office and routine like nothing had changed, but I could feel the difference in the way people looked at me, how the message of that day rippled further than I could track. At first, it was just a few emails from students, quiet, hesitant messages that began with, "I was there during your talk," or, "I've never heard someone say what you said before." They weren't long, and they didn't ask for anything. They just wanted to be seen. Then came the calls. A guidance counselor from the school reached out to thank me, said a few students who hadn't spoken all year suddenly wanted to talk. One had printed out quotes from my speech and taped them to his locker. Another asked if she could learn more about entrepreneurship, even though she had always believed she wasn't smart enough. They weren't stories I was supposed to hear, but somehow they found their way to me, and I realized something. I hadn't just revisited the school. I had disrupted it. A few weeks later, I was invited back again. This time not for a speech, but for a meeting. The new vice principal wanted to discuss launching a mentorship program. They'd never had one before, not really. The school's priorities had always been grades, compliance, discipline, but now, after what they'd seen, they were considering the idea that maybe those things weren't enough. Maybe belief needed to be taught too. I accepted, but under one condition, that the program wouldn't focus only on the straight-A students, that it would find the quiet ones, the kids with missing homework and messy lives, the ones most people had already given up on. "I want the ones who sit in the back and never raise their hands," I told them, "because those are the ones with the loudest stories." To my surprise, they agreed. We started small, just 6 students. I met with them twice a month in a spare classroom with a broken clock and dusty shelves. We didn't talk about business at first. We talked about pressure, about fear, about what it felt like to be labeled before you even had a chance to define yourself. Some of them barely spoke during those early sessions. Others opened up like cracked glass. They weren't looking for a savior. They were looking for someone who wouldn't flinch at their truth. I brought in friends from my world. Designers, coders, freelancers, creatives, people who had once been told they were impossible. They sat in that same room and told stories of failure and persistence. And slowly, the students changed. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in subtle ways. One started a YouTube channel about fashion. Another began coding his first game. One girl, who had been skipping class for months, began showing up just to sit in that circle. Not because we offered credit, but because we offered belief. The program grew. The school made space for it, gave us better rooms, real supplies. A teacher who had once laughed at the idea of mentoring drifters asked to sit in on a session. And that year, for the first time in the school's history, a student who had been in behavioral probation since freshman year was chosen to speak at graduation. He quoted my talk without naming me directly. I watched from the crowd, hidden in the back, as he said, "They said I'd never get here." But that was before I knew I didn't need permission. That line stayed with me, because that had been the truth all along. No one needs permission to matter. They just need a crack in the wall big enough to see the sky. One afternoon, while reviewing plans to expand the mentorship initiative citywide, I got another letter. Handwritten. No return address. I opened it slowly. It was from Mrs. Ellsworth. Handwriting was delicate, but sure. She didn't apologize. She didn't mention what she had once said to me. All she wrote was, "I was wrong about a lot of things. Thank you for returning anyway." It was only one sentence, but it was enough, because it proved what I had always hoped. Even the walls we think are permanent can shift. Even those who once doubted us can learn to watch us rise, and even the systems that once silenced us can, if pressed hard enough, become spaces for stories that heal. I folded the letter carefully and placed it next to the one she wrote years ago, the one that said I would never make it, side by side, the past and present. Proof that sometimes the only revenge you ever need is to build something that outlives the lie.